believe you're talking about Pure Invention, How Japan's Pop Culture Conquered the World, coming out from Penguin Random House's Crown imprint in June of 2020. Is that the book you're referring to?
That's exactly the book I'm referring to.
Yeah, well, thanks for reading it. You're one of the first readers, and that was my big step up into the big boy world of grown-up writing, so to speak, and it was a huge jump out of my safety zone and incredibly stressful. And if I had known how incredibly difficult to pull off it would have proven, and I'm not talking about I'm just talking about the sheer logistics of it all, I would have probably not been as excited to sign the deal as I was. But I think I'm pretty happy with it. It turned out pretty well. For those just tuning in, it's a book where I basically track down the creators or the first examples of all sorts of kind of key pop cultural things, like the very first toy made after World War II, the very first karaoke machine, the very first Hello Kitty product, the very first Famicom, and the person who invented. And I track those down and then talk to the people who made them as much as I could. Or if they're not around anymore, as was the case with many of the older things, just do as much research on, in Japanese newspapers and magazines of the era to try to pull together a story of why and how these crazy things came together and how they formed this kind of basis to make all of this wild kind of virtual culture that Japan made in the 90s and 2000s that are kind of so ubiquitous today.
Yeah, I had some thoughts from having read the entire manuscript and just sped read it just a few minutes before doing this. I don't know, man. It's a pretty spectacular. The level of research is pretty bananas.
It's like why did these things come about at this particular moment in space time? Do you know what I mean? And of course, the person who made them is extremely important, but it's also you can't really understand the rise of televised anime or manga in particular if you don't understand I didn't realize this until I really started digging into it. If you don't understand labor movements and protest movements and the entire anti-war movement of Japan and the establishment movement of Japan in the 60s, you can't understand manga. You can't. And it turned more into kind of a socio-cultural history that's anchored by the products than being a guidebook to the products. And so it turned into this weird narrative. this kind of wow, okay.
Yeah, it's sort of one thing leads to another. I mean, I think other books have touched on some of those things that happened in anime that sort of fermented and kind of led to the modern industry. But things are how kawaii led to Hello Kitty, and that led to the creation of Mario, and then into Kogaru consumer culture. There's a lot of really, that to me is the really illuminating part of it, because
right.
I don't know if anyone's really made those connections before in English. I don't know if you were what sources were you using to kind of put those threads together?
So one of the things that I realized when I started working on the book was that there's a ton of standalone histories of almost everything out there, how the Walkman got made, or how Nintendo rose as a company, or Hello Kitty, why Sanrio is how Sanrio came to be. But the problem is either they're standalone, or more commonly, if the book is in English, it almost exclusively focuses on how Americans or Westerners consume it, which doesn't really tell you anything about why did Japanese people invent karaoke? Why didn't Americans invent that, or Spanish people, or African people? Why Japanese people? And so I just read a lot. I would go back to the National Diet Library and look. I try to find all of the newspaper and magazine articles around the times of these things coming together, or the first reports of them, and seeing how they were talked about. And it was really interesting in karaoke. It was seen as the scourge of Japan for a really long time. It was seen as causing fights and clubs and being noise pollution, and cops were trying to crack down on it. I didn't know any of that.
One thing that kept popping out over and over again with almost practically every invention is no one having any faith that these products will amount to anything, whether it's Pokemon or the Super Nintendo. It's just this has no chance. It's a miracle a lot of these things even were released to the general public.
I think one of the big takeaways for me is, and I don't even mean this as like a bashing of the government kind of thing, but just like what BS the Cool Japan program is, because almost by definition, the things that take off are things that nobody expects, you know? And like now looking back, it's crazy to think that Nintendo was even thinking that was not thinking to export Pokemon because they didn't think Americans would get it. But that's like the truth. Like even Miyamoto Shigeru, the guy who created Super Mario Brothers, a dude who you think would have his finger on the pulse of what kids want to play, was in the very beginning like, oh, this is a fun game, but I just don't think foreign kids are going to get it. It'll just be something like, a little fad thing that's going to happen in Japan if we're lucky.
Yeah, I mean...
So, even like experts don't get it. That's the crazy thing.
There's doubt on the Japanese side at the corporate level, but then there's also, like, when it comes to America, like the guy who invented Armor Attack or like Star Castle saying, these Japanese games are stupid, man. They're never going to take off.
Exactly.
So there's almost like these like two gatekeepers of just like complete assholes that are trying to keep my Pokemon or like my Super Mario away from me. It's if not for like the fickle finger of fate, what a very different world we'd be living in today.
Exactly. Although then you realize, especially toward the spoiler alert, toward the end of the book, one of the big key Japanese inventions is the invention of image boards, Need Channel, which gives rise in America to a site you might have heard of called 4channel. And 4chan is like basically the destruction of gatekeepers, right? It's like the complete democratization of like any random ass thought that pops into your head, like Tourette syndrome style, to be spread across the entire planet with absolutely unfettered. And that gives you a totally different type of problem, than the one where gatekeepers are telling you what you can or can't look at. Like suddenly you're getting like, you wake up in the morning and turn on your computer and you're getting like porno, anime, Bernie Sanders memes like beamed into your brain. And it's just, it's really interesting to see that we're still kind of struggling with that.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to go back to an era where like some cigar smoking dude at like a local television station's like, these Japanese cartoons aren't going to, I'm not going to put this shit in the airwaves.
What does Variety magazine says about like Arabian Nights? There's no way anyone could get excited about cartoon breasts in an X-rated cartoon.
I love that moment. It's one of my favorite moments of the book. Is literally it's Tezuka Osamu's Cleopatra, like 1001 Nights of Sin or something. What's
Queen
it
of Sex. Cleopatra, Queen of Sex.
Queen of Sex. So, and number one, the fact that like Japan's most celebrated children's cartoon creator decided like, oh, I'm actually going to make a porn. So what you're referring to is when that film debuted in America in like 70...
A few years later after it was originally released in Japan.
Yeah. At the same time Fritz the Cat did in America.
The X-rated animation boom of the early 70s, yeah.
Exactly. And Fritz the Cat scooped it by like days to be the first X-rated cartoon ever to be screened in America. But Variety magazine just savaged the Tezuka film, saying that there's no way in hell that any human being would ever like get off to the sight of cartoon breasts. And now like on Pornhub, as of last year, like the vying constantly for between number 1 and 2 is the search term hentai. So
well, there you go. One thing I also like, a key concept in the book is this idea of Japan creating these things that you call fantasy delivery devices.
Oh, yes.
And how Pokemon's a fantasy delivery device, Tamagotchi is a fantasy delivery device, anime is. Something that happens in the epilogue, it's also, I mean, the book sort of ends on a weird note, as well as spoilers, but, I mean, you touch on this idea that maybe Japan is not the future, that maybe this was the 20th century to some respect, but we don't really know. We're in the moment, it's difficult to kind of see what's on the horizon, but it's possible during this...
We caught up. Everybody's caught up now. Like it's kind of like this great synchronization. Like the internet is the glue that holds that together. Like we're all connected in real time now. When like a toilet paper riot happens in Tokyo, like within 15 minutes, like people are tweeting about it in Sacramento. It's like it's not even 15 minutes, 15 seconds. So like things have caught up. But like what I was trying to say, what I really do believe is that it's not that Japan is not ahead of the curve anymore. It's like the entire world is kind of Japanized to this like really great degree. Like we are basically all living in the lost decades of Japan right now. That post-bubble come down, like the economic like crash, the political dysfunction, the societal dysfunction and chaos. Like Japan lived through that shit 20 years ago, which is why all of the stuff it made during that time
resonating,
became
perhaps.
so relevant, like, to us now, because we're all like, you remember this, like as recent as 10 years ago, like right before, even less than that, before the 2008 financial crash, you'd see all of these like constant string of like Western reporters going to Japan and being like, oh my God, kids, adults playing video games. Oh my God, like, wow, adults like jacking off to cartoon porn. Whoa, like they don't even have jobs, and not doing any of the research to realize why people were doing that.
They don't leave the house, Matt. They don't have girlfriends. They choose not to have sex.
Exactly. Like virtual idols. Oh my God! What's happening to humanity? And now, like every single one of those milestones that we were making fun of Japanese people has become the status quo in the West. Like there's less young men living like on their own or with a girlfriend or boyfriend or whatever than at any time in history since like 1940. Like we're all turning into kind of hikikomori. We're all turning into otaku. Like the average person, like the average grown-up can like discourse on the Avengers now in America. That's crazy. Like when I was a kid, you would have been beaten for saying you were into comic books. Like I never in my wildest dreams imagined that it would play out this way. I mean, I don't know how, if I'm happy or sad or what, but it's
it is the new anime century, as it was declared in Shinjuku in 1981.
The new anime century declaration in Shinjuku in 1981 was like this kind of Woodstock for Japanese otaku, for people who haven't heard about it. And it was 20,000 kids packed into the square right in front of not the west side.
East side,
the east
exit.
The east side of the station, to basically like meet, to see all of the people who made the Gundam anime for the first time. Because like up until then, the only way you can get information is either from conventions or magazines. Like there weren't many events or anything like that. And there are moments there of like, it's like the first public cosplay in Japan, and like the declaration is actually being read by Mamoru Nagano, who went on to design like a bunch of he's like an otaku. I mean, he did 5-star stories. Like he designed a bunch of the key like Gundam mecha, and he's like standing on stage dressed like Char, like reading like really solemnly, this is a new anime century, and it came true. Look at us. Look at you, Patrick.
Well, it's this kind of like utopian vision of like the new anime century. But on the other hand, like the thing that actually connects with audiences and creates the real revolution is a nude scene, a cartoon nude scene of Sila Moss in the Gundam movie. Like that's the thing that actually is the new anime century. It's like cartoon nudity. So like congratulations on the book. Again, it's the greatest thing since Cat in the Hat, I think.
Thank you.
So what's next? I mean, when does the book come out? When does it hit the Walden Books?
It's going to be coming out in June of 2020, and I'm hoping that there's going to be some excerpts of it published in various outlets before then, and we can talk more about that when the time comes. But yeah, I thank you. It's really cool. It's really weird to be done with it.